Hey guys, this is activity 4.3, due for a win. This is on page 25 of the Unit 8 workbook. If you don't have the workbook, that's okay. You can just write this down on a separate sheet of paper and just kind of pay attention as we go through this. You guys just watched a video on Khan Academy where Mr. Khan talked about, the first video I think was a pretty simple probability of pulling out a certain marble out of a bag. The second one had some more complex ones with a different sample space and different outcomes possible. And tomorrow you guys will focus a little bit more on those outcomes, on different types of outcomes and how we can set those up with different diagrams. But in this video, I want to revisit something from last week, which was the probability, theoretical probability and experimental. So we're going to review those a little bit. And yeah, so let's just get into it and start talking about the situation that's pretty familiar with everybody, flipping a coin, right? So we're going to assume in this case, flipping a coin, it's going to be a 50-50. There's no possibility of it landing on its edge, just for the purposes of this activity. So remember last week, theoretical probability is, for when you're flipping a coin, is 50-50, right? It's a 1 out of 2 chance you're going to get a head or a tail, right? They're equally likely than not. Experimental probability means, well, what if we actually conduct the experiment and we flip a coin 10 times, 50 times, 100 times? Are we going to get exactly half heads and half tails? And you guys know, no, not necessarily, right? And that's why it's called experimental probability. Theory tells us it should be 50-50. Experimental means that it might not happen, because we know in the real world it doesn't always work out perfectly. All right, so let's take a look. You flip a coin once and it lands heads up. Would that be surprising or not surprising? Probably not surprising, right? It could happen. Not surprising. It's possible. How about if you flip a coin twice and it lands heads up both times? Again, that's probably not very surprising. It could happen. It could just as equally happen. Maybe it lands tails 2 times in a row, right? Not anything that's too surprising. Well, what if you flip it 100 times and it lands heads up every single time? That is where you're probably going to be a little bit surprised and start to do what? Question it, right? This coin is not fair. That something's going on here, right? That would be one of those, maybe a brother or sister or cousin, somebody's playing a trick on you, right? There's no way it could go 100 times and never land tails. So that would be something you'd start to question. And that's what I'm trying to get to, is when we know in theory what it should be, when it just totally flies off that theory and goes towards a different direction, that usually should make our mind think that there's something going on, something we need to question. All right, so let's take a look at a few more examples. So if we do flip the coin 100 times, I think we've already kind of covered this part. If we do flip it 100 times, what should happen in theory? Well, we should expect about half the time, 50 times, that the probability would be, that we would get a heads, 50 times out of 100. And if you flip a coin 100 times, what would be reasonable? We know it might not be exactly 50-50, so maybe what, 40 to 60? So if we get 40 to 60 heads out of 100, I mean, we would probably think that's pretty fair. I mean, probably is pretty legit. If we get a head 90 out of 100, again, that's when we know that something is probably going on in this situation that we need to take a look at. All right, last question. Okay, this is actually an interesting one. So if you flip the coin 3 times and it's come up heads once, right? So the cumulative fraction would be 1 out of 3. We're ahead. If you flip the coin 1 more time, will it land heads up to make a cumulative fraction of 2 out of 4? So if we flip the coin 3 times and we've gotten a head once, are we guaranteed to get a head on the next flip? And the answer, you guys know, is no, right? What's the chances, if you've done 1 out of 3, right? 1 out of 3 heads. What's the chances that on that next flip you're going to get a head? Well, the fraction is still a half chance, right? 1 out of 2. So that's something we've got to, you kind of think about a little bit. And you might think to yourself, well, yeah, that makes sense. Well, a lot of people don't think that. If the chances are always still 1 out of 2, no matter how many times. I mean, even again, 99 out of 100. That next time it's got to be heads. It's got to be heads. Well, not necessarily. It's still a 1 out of 2 chance every single time you flip that coin. Okay. All right. So moral of the story on this one, theoretical probability versus experimental probability. theory tells us we know kind of what it should be when it comes to the likelihood of something happening, and experimental probability we know doesn't always go exactly as we planned, but it should be in some type of realm of reason, right? Like we talked about in this one, 40 to 60. I mean, it should have some type of range that makes sense according to the probability of it happening. All right, thanks guys for listening.